Welcome to another edition of Biblical Errancy Commentary, the series that takes a critical look at Scripture, pointing out its numerous errors, contradictions, and fallacies. This program teaches a kind of Sunday school in reverse by giving you the biblical information that you should have heard but didn't. With millions of Americans hearing a totally one-sided presentation of the Bible, balance is greatly needed. Only when people are given both sides of an issue can a truly objective analysis be possible. And here to provide the alternative perspective is the editor of Biblical Errancy newsletter, Mr. Dennis McKenzie.
Welcome to the 10th edition of Biblical Errancy Commentary. We're glad you're here. This program, as well as some to follow, will concentrate on nearly all of the major heroes of the Bible, with the exception of Jesus and Paul, who will receive special attention in later programs. For now, we'll focus on such figures as God, the patriarchs, the matriarchs, and Peter. If there is any fact that emerges from the maze of boring data found throughout the Bible by someone reading the book for the first time, it is the incredible number of instances in which the major figures, the beings whom today's children are taught to admire and respect, exhibit behavior that can only be described as disgusting and appalling. Throughout the book, especially the Old Testament, one is struck with the number of times in which the good guys are anything but models of rectitude. Generally speaking, they could more easily be classified as mafiosi than saints. Unless a substantial amount of censorship is employed, parents who awaken their children on Sunday morning in order to read about these characters in Sunday school could be accused of child abuse. For believers in the Bible to deny the corruption of its central figures would be useless in view of the fact that an overwhelming amount of evidence is available, a fact readily admitted by some of the book's more open proponents. On page 233 in the book entitled Today's Handbook for Solving Bible Difficulties, apologist David O'Brien concedes, quote, "When we read the Bible, we assume that all the great men of Scripture would make wonderful deacons or elders in our church. But in fact, there's hardly a person in the Old Testament who would even be allowed to join most of our churches without some major modifications in behavior," unquote. On page 260 in the same book, he says, quote, "Keep in mind the fact that very few of God's chosen instruments were without fault or serious sin. Moses was a murderer. David was an adulterer and a murderer. Jacob was a con man. And Abraham was a liar. Jonah was a racist who rebelled at the idea that God would forgive the Assyrians. And what about Peter's impulsiveness and the contentious spirits displayed by James and John?" Unquote. Well, at least one apologist doesn't deny the obvious. In answer to fellow Christians who concocted an excuse to account for Noah's drunkenness, O'Brien continues by saying on page 185 in the same book, quote, "Nowhere in Scripture does it teach that fermentation began after the flood or that Noah's drunkenness is the innocent result of drinking what he thought was wholesome grape juice. It does Scripture no honor to invent ways to make offensive events palatable to us when Scripture itself records them and makes no effort to sanitize them," unquote. In other words, Noah was drunk, and it wasn't done by grape juice. Oh, if only more apologists were as open and forthright. Now that we have completed a broad overview of this program's contents, the question becomes one of proving that the Bible's heroes are not paragons of propriety, but prototypes of perversity. Turning to the characters themselves, the question becomes one of deciding who should receive priority, who should be at the head of the list, who should be exposed first. Undoubtedly, the most important figure in the entire Bible is God Himself, and for that reason He should be placed in front of the pack. No one has a role comparable to His. In fact, the Bible is supposed to be His Word. So who would be more qualified to receive top billing? On page 185 in O'Brien's book, the author distinguishes God from all other figures by saying, quote, "The only real hero is God." And in the same vein, on page 28 in the book entitled Reason to Believe, the apologist R.C. Sproul states, quote, "Nowhere do we find God involved in capricious or arbitrary acts of judgment. His wrath is never directed against the innocent. His anger never flows without reason. It is always directed against human rebellion and sin." Unquote. Few comments are more at odds with reality because facts prove precisely